2004 torture and starvation death of her girlfriend's 9-year-old son. 28-year-old Lisa Ann Coleman died at 6:24 Wednesday evening. The Supreme Court denied her final appeal hours before her execution. It is rare for a woman to be executed in the States. She is only the 15th woman to be executed since the death penalty resumed in 1976. But during that same amount of time, around 1,400 men had been put to death. The journalists who were present at the time of the execution are reporting the death went smoothly and Coleman seemed peaceful. She was pronounced dead 12 minutes after being lethally injected, something WFAA implied was almost too quick considering her crime.
The death took just 12 minutes, far shorter than that of Devontae Williams, a 9-year-old boy who died over a period of weeks.
His name was Devontae, a bright, innocent 9-year-old boy who should have been laughing, learning, and living life like every child deserves. Instead, when paramedics found him, he weighed just 35 pounds, covered in over 250 injuries, scars from restraints, burns, and unimaginable torment. This wasn't a tragedy that happened overnight. This was long-term, deliberate torture inside a home that became his prison. And at the center of that cruelty was Lisa Ann Coleman, not a protector, not a guardian, but a woman who treated a child's suffering as routine. The state of Texas would later call her actions inhuman, sadistic, and merciless. For this crime, a crime that shook even hardened investigators, Texas prepared to carry out a rare and final punishment, the execution of a woman. This is not a story of excuses. This is not about sympathy. This is about accountability, justice, and a child whose voice was stolen long before his life ended. So to understand how a little boy ended up starved, broken, and silenced, we need to walk through the timeline of neglect, cruelty, and cold-blooded abuse. But before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next jaw-dropping true crime story. Lisa Ann Coleman was born on October 6, 1975, in Fort Worth, Texas, entering the world not into warmth, safety, or nurturing, but into instability, neglect, and emotional turbulence that would ripple through every stage of her development, growing up in an environment where childhood innocence was replaced with survival instinct. As a young girl, she bounced between unstable homes, frequently placed in foster care, where documented reports later revealed incidents of physical mistreatment and sexual abuse that scarred her early psychological wiring, leaving behind the deep imprint of a child who learned very early that pain could come from the very people meant to protect her. She struggled academically, never progressing beyond approximately a 10th grade level, not because of lack of intelligence, but because school was never a place of learning. It was an escape from chaos, and even then, one that never lasted long, as truancy, instability, and emotional disruption made consistent attendance nearly impossible. By her teenage years, she was already navigating the edges of the criminal system with minor offenses, shoplifting, petty theft, and later burglary, not as acts of thrill or calculated crime, but as signs of a young person learning to meet her needs through whatever broken channels were available to her. As she entered adulthood, she found companionship, not in family, not in community, but in another wounded soul, Marcella Williams, a woman with demons of her own. Their relationship was not a storybook love. It was trauma bonding, two damaged individuals who found comfort not in healing each other, but in validating each other's pain. Together, they formed a household built on secrecy, isolation, and psychological codependence, a dynamic where Coleman increasingly assumed the role of caretaker, not only in domestic tasks but in authority and control. In that apartment where the outside world rarely intruded, Coleman's identity became fused with discipline, surveillance, and restriction, behaviors shaped not only by her adult choices, but by the fractured nervous system of a woman who had never truly been safe, never truly been free, and had never learned how to nurture, only how to survive. By the summer of 2004, the fragile and troubled household of Lisa Coleman and Marcella Williams was home to Devontae Marcel Williams, a 9-year-old boy whose life had already been marked by instability and neglect. Small, quiet, and largely unseen, Devontae became a silent witness to the intense and often volatile power dynamic between his mother and Lisa Coleman, a relationship built less on affection and more on control, dominance, and the strange codes of loyalty forged by trauma. In this apartment, the walls themselves seemed to absorb the tension. Marcella's authority as a mother clashing with Coleman's emerging role as enforcer, disciplinarian, and caretaker, a person who dictated rules, monitored movements, and imposed punishments that would later shock investigators and horrify the public. The child lived in near total isolation, cut off from extended family, rarely seen by neighbors, and shielded from even minimal oversight by Child Protective Services, a system that had already encountered warning signs but had not intervened effectively. Over time, the control exerted by Coleman extended beyond ordinary discipline into alarming patterns. Devontae was reportedly bound for hours, restricted from basic freedoms, and subjected to punishments that were cruel, prolonged, and sometimes ritualized, leaving both physical scars and emotional terror. One has to wonder, how much does isolation distort a child's understanding of love, trust, and fear? And at what point does discipline cross the invisible line into abuse? As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, secrecy became the household's foundation. The outside world was kept at bay, visits curtailed, friends discouraged, and communication minimized, creating an environment where the boy's suffering went unnoticed and unchallenged, a carefully hidden storm that only those inside could see. Neighbors later described the home as quiet, seemingly normal, but behind closed doors the routines of control and punishment escalated, with Coleman's influence over the household growing ever more absolute, reinforcing a pattern of dominance, surveillance, and emotional manipulation that masked the true horror from anyone outside. And here we pause for reflection because as viewers we are forced to ask, to what extent do childhood traumas, like those Lisa Coleman endured, influence the way adults behave? Can such trauma ever excuse the choices they make, or does it merely explain them? Think about it, because the answer is rarely simple, and in cases like this, the lines between victim and perpetrator blur in ways that challenge everything we think we know about justice. On the morning of July 26, 2004, the fragile veil of secrecy surrounding the Coleman-Williams household finally shattered, exposing a tragedy that had been hidden for far too long. Emergency responders were called to the Arlington, Texas apartment, a small, dimly lit unit that bore no outward signs of the horror within, only to find Devontae Marcel Williams, age 9, unconscious, emaciated, and gravely ill, a child who should have been full of life, energy, and innocence, instead reduced to a near-skeletal figure weighing roughly 35 to 36 pounds, a body that screamed of prolonged starvation and relentless neglect. Medical personnel, upon examination, discovered a scene that no parent, neighbor, or investigator could ignore. Over 250 documented scars, bruises, and injuries, evidence of repeated binding, burns, and punishment over months, perhaps years, that had left the boy both physically and emotionally shattered. Every mark told a story of fear, pain, and silent suffering. The very hands that should have nurtured him had become instruments of cruelty, and the walls that should have protected him had confined him in a nightmare that no child should endure. Once emergency responders removed Devontae from the apartment, law enforcement quickly moved to secure the scene, documenting every detail of the cramped Arlington unit, photographing injuries, and collecting physical evidence that painted a harrowing picture of prolonged abuse. Investigators interviewed neighbors. Neighbors described unusual silence punctuated by occasional shouting, and discovered that the boy had been kept isolated from school and extended family, a deliberate effort by those in the household to conceal the ongoing maltreatment. CPS records showed a history of prior concerns, complaints, and minor investigations that had failed to intervene effectively, leaving Devontae exposed to continued neglect and violence. Officers noted the meticulously controlled environment, from locked doors to controlled movements, and observed the evidence of bindings, burn marks, and extreme malnutrition, all pointing to sustained abuse orchestrated within the apartment itself. Both Marcella Williams, the boy's mother, and Lisa Coleman were taken into custody for questioning. Marcella, already familiar with law enforcement due to prior incidents, eventually accepted responsibility and agreed to a plea, while Coleman, whose role as the dominant figure in the household became increasingly clear, maintained a more defiant stance. Statements were collected, corroborated by forensic evidence, and reinforced by medical expert testimony describing the boy's injuries, which demonstrated repeated patterns of cruelty and deliberate restraint. The severity of the case and the presence of a statutory aggravator, capital murder committed during the commission of a kidnapping, prompted prosecutors to file charges against Coleman with the full weight of the Texas legal system. She was formally arrested, and the legal process moved swiftly to prepare for trial. By the end of the investigation, the evidence painted an unflinching portrait of a child trapped in an environment dominated by fear, control, and violence, and of an adult who had assumed complete authority over the boy's daily existence, ultimately setting the stage for one of the most shocking and closely scrutinized trials in Texas history. In 2006, the trial of Lisa Ann Coleman commenced in Tarrant County, Texas, drawing intense scrutiny from media outlets, legal observers, and the public alike, all captivated by the horrific details of the case. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the gravity of what would unfold within its walls. A confrontation between law, morality, and the harrowing consequences of a childhood steeped in neglect turned into adulthood cruelty. The prosecution began methodically, building a narrative that left no room for ambiguity. Medical examiners took the stand, recounting their grim findings with clinical precision. Devonte Marcel Williams, age 9, had died weighing only 35 to 36 pounds, his body marked by over 250 injuries, including burns, bruises, and scars, many of them evidence of repeated binding and confinement over months, possibly years. Forensic specialists explained the medical consequences of prolonged malnutrition and severe physical restraint, explaining how the child's bones had become fragile, his organs compromised, and his development arrested by systematic abuse. Each expert painted a picture of cruelty so deliberate it could not be mistaken for negligence. Investigators detailed the conditions inside the Arlington apartment, describing locked doors, controlled routines, and deliberate efforts to isolate Devonte from school, neighbors, and extended family. Witnesses recounted visits where the boy was visibly withdrawn, fearful, and emaciated, and how attempts by outsiders to intervene had been systematically blocked. The prosecution argued that Lisa Coleman had assumed complete control over the household, enforcing punishment, restricting movement, and ensuring secrecy, ultimately satisfying the statutory aggravator that the murder occurred during a kidnapping, defined by the confinement and removal of Devonte from normal supervision and contact. Visual evidence played a chilling role in the courtroom. Photographs of Devonte's injuries, the apartment's interior, and objects used in his restraint were shown to the jury, leaving a haunting imprint of the suffering he endured. Each image, each testimony, reinforced the portrayal of Coleman as the orchestrator of a small-scale prison, a child's life subjected to fear and control at the hands of the adults entrusted with his care. The defense, in response, painted a contrasting picture, emphasizing Coleman's own tortured history. Attorneys recounted her childhood in foster care, the physical and sexual abuse she endured, her limited education, and her repeated exposure to criminal environments. They argued that these experiences had profoundly affected her psychological development and her understanding of relationships, discipline, and authority. They pleaded for the jury to consider these mitigating factors carefully, urging that while Coleman's actions were unquestionably horrific, they had been shaped by decades of trauma, abandonment, and unaddressed mental health struggles. Marcella Williams, the boy's mother, accepted a plea deal, agreeing to life imprisonment without parole for 40 years, leaving Coleman to face the full weight of the death penalty. The contrast between mother and partner, between plea acceptance and trial defiance, intensified the emotional gravity of the proceedings. The trial stretched over several days, each session building tension as witnesses recounted graphic and heart-wrenching details of Devonte's life, injuries, and final moments. The jury heard arguments from both sides, weighed medical evidence against psychological testimony, and considered the severe abuse in light of Coleman's personal history. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict for capital murder, and during the sentencing phase, the evidence of her abusive control, combined with the aggravating kidnapping factor, compelled the jury to impose a death sentence, marking Coleman as one of the rare women in Texas to face execution, and setting in motion a series of appeals, legal battles, and public debates over justice, trauma, and accountability that would continue for years. After her conviction and death sentence, Lisa Ann Coleman was sent to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, the state's maximum security facility for death row inmates, where she would spend her days in isolation, confined to a small cell, with only brief moments of human contact and a life measured in hours and days. From there, her fight for survival moved into the complex labyrinth of state and federal appeals, a legal battlefield where every filing, every motion, and every brief had the potential to alter the trajectory of her life. Her attorneys scrutinized every aspect of her trial, from witness testimony to procedural rulings, seeking errors or constitutional grounds that could overturn the verdict or at least delay the execution. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed her case, examining claims that ranged from alleged trial missteps to challenges over the application of the kidnapping aggravator, which had elevated the murder to a capital offense. The court ultimately affirmed her conviction and death sentence, stating that the evidence of deliberate abuse, confinement, and control over Devonte Williams met the statutory requirements for capital punishment under Texas law. Undeterred, Coleman's legal team pursued relief in federal courts, filing habeas corpus petitions that questioned the effectiveness of her trial counsel, the admissibility of certain evidence, and whether the jury had sufficiently considered her traumatic childhood and psychological history as mitigating factors. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed these claims in exhaustive detail but ultimately denied relief, narrowing her remaining options. In the final days, emergency appeals reached the United States Supreme Court, but each was rejected, closing the last legal doors she could pursue. Alongside the legal efforts, public advocacy emerged. Anti-death penalty organizations, clergy, and groups like the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty highlighted her history of abuse, mental health struggles, and the controversial application of the kidnapping aggravator. Petitions circulated, letters were sent to officials, and media coverage amplified the tension between the demand for justice for Devonte Williams and the ethical questions surrounding the execution of a woman whose own life had been marked by trauma. Despite these combined legal and social efforts, the Board of Pardons and Paroles and the Governor of Texas ultimately denied clemency, leaving Coleman with no further avenues for relief. By the end of this chapter, the path to execution was set in stone, transforming a private nightmare from the Arlington apartment into a public reckoning, a confrontation between law, morality, and the human consequences of decades of trauma and abuse, all converging in the sterile walls of the Texas death row system. The day of Lisa Ann Coleman's execution arrived on September 17, 2014, at the Huntsville Unit, the Texas facility where all state executions are carried out. Hours before the scheduled time, the prison was a scene of quiet intensity, guards moving with disciplined precision, staff performing final checks, and the execution chamber standing silent, a place where the gravity of life and death converged. Coleman had been transferred from the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, her home on female death row, to Huntsville under strict escort, confined to a solitary cell until the moment of execution. On that final day, Coleman was offered the traditional last meal, but Texas had eliminated the practice of granting special requests, and she accepted what was on the prison menu, a simple meal in line with state regulations, marking a quiet, understated conclusion to a life under constant scrutiny and control. Witnesses in the chamber included prison officials, a few selected members of the media, and spiritual advisors, while family members of Devonte Williams and a small number of supporters observed from designated areas. Reports indicated that Coleman remained calm in her final hours, maintaining composure as prison staff processed the required protocols. She spent a decade on death row, navigating appeals, legal battles, and public scrutiny, yet the day of reckoning had arrived with unwavering certainty. At 6:24 p.m., the lethal injection procedure commenced. As the sedative entered her veins, the finality of the moment weighed heavily over the room. In her final statement, Coleman addressed her family. "I just want to tell my family I love them, my son, I love him," Coleman said, according to a statement released by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. "God is good. I'm done." Moments later, monitors confirmed vital signs, and Lisa Ann Coleman was pronounced dead, becoming one of the few women in Texas history to face execution, and one of the rare cases that drew national attention due to the severity of her crimes and the complex psychological and ethical questions surrounding them. The aftermath rippled across media reports, legal commentary, and public discourse. Some viewed the execution as justice for Devonte Williams, a necessary closure to a case defined by unimaginable cruelty. Others raised questions about whether trauma and a lifetime of abuse could ever mitigate such a sentence, sparking debate about the ethics of capital punishment, especially for women who had endured extensive suffering before committing their crimes. The story of Lisa Ann Coleman is a haunting reminder of how trauma, choices, and consequences collide in ways that leave lasting scars on everyone involved. Now, we want to hear from you. If you were the judge in this case, what sentence would you have handed down? Would you have chosen life or death? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know your perspective. And if you found this story compelling, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories, in-depth documentaries, and the real-life tales that keep you on the edge of your seat.